Japan, a land of warriors, emperors, and revolutionaries. From the rise of the Yamato court to the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, this nation has gone through waves of change, cultural, political, and military, shaping not just its destiny, but the course of world history. This is the story of Japan, a tale spanning thousands of years of tradition, upheaval, and innovation. Before the samurai, before the emperors, and long before the modern metropolis of Tokyo, there was a Japan vastly different from what we know today. Imagine a world in which the islands of Japan were inhabited by small, nomadic tribes, hunter-gatherers who lived in the forests and along the coasts, deeply connected to the natural world around them. This was Japan in the JŌMON period, a time when pottery was the cutting-edge technology and rice farming was yet unknown. The story of Japan's origins starts here, in an era of simplicity that laid the groundwork for one of the most complex and sophisticated cultures the world has ever seen. The JŌMON period is named after the distinctive pottery that these early inhabitants left behind. JŌMON literally means cord-marked, referring to the intricate patterns made by pressing cords into wet clay. This pottery is not only one of the oldest in the world, but also a symbol of the cultural ingenuity of these early peoples. The JŌMON people are believed to have arrived in Japan during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and land bridges connected the Japanese islands to the Asian continent. For thousands of years, they lived as hunter-gatherers, relying on the rich natural environment to sustain them. The forests provided game such as deer and boar, while the rivers and coasts teemed with fish and shellfish. Archaeological evidence shows that they even hunted marine mammals like dolphins and whales, which were a valuable source of food and materials. Yet, despite living in what modern eyes might see as a primitive lifestyle, the JŌMON people were far from unsophisticated. Their pottery, for instance, was not merely functional, but often highly artistic. The JŌMON were among the first humans in the world to make pottery, and their designs became increasingly complex over time, showing a deep appreciation for aesthetics. Some of their pots are decorated with elaborate patterns that were likely imbued with spiritual or symbolic meaning. This suggests that the JŌMON had a rich spiritual life, possibly worshipping natural forces or ancestors. The JŌMON people lived in small communities scattered across the islands of Japan. While many were nomadic, moving with the seasons to follow game or find new fishing grounds, others built semi-permanent settlements. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of pit dwellings, houses dug into the ground with thatched roofs, which were likely used for several years before being abandoned or rebuilt. One of the most fascinating aspects of JŌMON society is the apparent lack of social stratification. Unlike later periods in Japanese history, where rigid class systems were established, the JŌMON appear to have lived in relatively egalitarian communities. There is little evidence of large-scale warfare or the kind of hierarchical organization that would later define Japanese society. Instead, the JŌMON seem to have been more concerned with survival, spirituality, and art. This is not to say that the JŌMON were completely isolated or static. Archaeological finds suggest that they engaged in trade with other groups, both within Japan and possibly even with the Asian mainland. Items such as jade, obsidian, and shells found in JŌMON sites indicate that goods were exchanged over long distances. This trading network likely helped spread new ideas and technologies, contributing to the gradual development of more complex societies. The JŌMON people's spirituality is another intriguing aspect of their culture. While there are no written records from this time, the artifacts they left behind offer tantalizing clues about their beliefs. Among the most famous of these are the dog, small humanoid figurines that have been found in many JŌMON sites. These figurines, often with exaggerated features such as large eyes or pregnant bellies, may have been used in fertility rites or other religious rituals. Some scholars believe that they represent deities or spirits, possibly ancestors who were revered by the community. Burial practices also suggest a belief in an afterlife or the importance of honoring the dead. Some JŌMON graves contain grave goods, pottery, tools, and even food offerings, suggesting that the deceased were believed to need these items in the next world. There is also evidence that the JŌMON may have practiced some form of ancestor worship, a tradition that would continue in later Japanese culture. By the end of the JŌMON period, life in Japan began to change dramatically. Around 300 BCE, new people arrived on the islands from the Korean peninsula, bringing with them revolutionary technologies, most notably rice farming. This marked the beginning of the Yayoi period, a time of great social, cultural, and technological transformation. The introduction of rice agriculture had a profound impact on Japanese society. Whereas the JŌMON had lived as hunter-gatherers for millennia, the Yayoi people were farmers. Rice paddies spread across the landscape, transforming both the environment and the way people lived. Farming required settled communities, and these villages grew larger and more complex than the small JŌMON settlements. The Yayoi also brought advanced metalworking skills, introducing bronze and iron tools and weapons. These technologies allowed for more efficient farming and hunting, but they also had a darker side. The appearance of bronze and iron weapons suggests that warfare became more common during this period, as different groups competed for land and resources. This was the beginning of a more hierarchical society, where wealth and power became concentrated in the hands of a few. By the 3rd century CE, the Yayoi had given way to the Kofun period, named after the massive burial mounds, or kofun, that began to dot the landscape. These mounds, some of which were as large as football fields, were the graves of powerful rulers who commanded large armies and controlled vast territories. The most powerful of these rulers belonged to the Yamato clan, which would eventually establish Japan's first centralized state. The Yamato state, which emerged in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, was heavily influenced by the cultures of Korea and China. The Yamato rulers adopted Chinese writing, government structures, and religious practices, including Buddhism, which was introduced to Japan in the 6th century. These influences helped to solidify the Yamato's power and unify much of Japan under their rule. The Yamato clan also claimed divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, a claim that would later form the basis of the Japanese imperial family's legitimacy. This divine connection gave the Yamato rulers an aura of sanctity and authority, setting the stage for the development of a centralized, hierarchical society. By the end of the Yamato period, in 710 CE, Japan had transformed from a land of scattered hunter-gatherer tribes into a unified state with a centralized government, a complex social hierarchy, and a rich cultural heritage. The JŌMON and Yayoi periods may seem distant and primitive compared to the later eras of samurai and shoguns, but they laid the essential foundations for what Japan would become. The spirit of innovation, the deep connection to nature, and the reverence for ancestors that characterized the JŌMON and Yayoi peoples would continue to shape Japanese culture for centuries to come. In the next chapter, we will see how these early influences were carried forward into the age of emperors, courtly intrigue, and the rise of the samurai. Japan, having risen from its JŌMON and Yayoi roots, was now entering an era where the sword, the pen, and the brushstroke would dominate the cultural landscape. From the glittering palaces of the Heian court to the blood-soaked battlefields of the Sengoku period, this chapter of Japanese history was one of contradictions. It was an age of refinement and brutal conflict, of artistic beauty and relentless ambition. The age of the samurai was a time when warlords carved out empires, and poets and scholars influenced the very essence of Japanese identity. The story of the samurai begins in the Heian period, named after the imperial capital of Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto. In 794, the Japanese court moved the capital from Nara to Heian-kyo, a decision that signaled the beginning of a new golden age. The Heian period is often remembered as a time of cultural brilliance, where art, literature, and poetry flourished under the patronage of the imperial court. However, beneath the surface of this refined world was a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. At the heart of the Heian court was the emperor, but in practice, true power often lay in the hands of noble families, particularly the powerful Fujiwara clan. The Fujiwara dominated the court by marrying their daughters into the imperial family, thereby securing positions of influence as regents and advisors to the emperor. This system of courtly politics ensured the Fujiwara's dominance for several centuries. During this time, Japan began to develop a distinctive culture, separate from the heavy influence of China. Court life in Heian was highly ritualized, with aristocrats spending their days composing poetry, exchanging letters, and engaging in elaborate tea ceremonies. This refined lifestyle is immortalized in works like The Tale of Genji, written by the court lady Murasaki Shikibu. Often considered the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji offers a window into the lives of the Heian elite, where aesthetics, love, and the pursuit of beauty were paramount. Yet, while the aristocracy lived in luxury, the rural provinces were increasingly neglected. The central government's control over the countryside weakened, and local warlords, called daimyo, began to rise in power. These daimyo relied on warrior clans to enforce their authority, and it was in this period that the samurai, the iconic warrior class of Japan, first began to emerge as a significant force. While the Heian aristocrats were more concerned with courtly intrigue than warfare, the samurai were gaining influence in the provinces. Initially, the samurai were little more than armed servants of the nobility, hired to protect estates and settle disputes between rival landowners. However, as the power of the central government eroded, the samurai took on greater responsibilities, eventually becoming the de facto rulers of many regions. The samurai were bound by a code of honor that would later become known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. While Bushido as a formalized concept would not fully develop until the later Edo period, many of its core principles, loyalty, courage, and honor, were already deeply ingrained in samurai culture during the Heian period. A samurai's primary duty was to serve his lord, or daimyo, without question, and this loyalty was often tested in brutal conflicts. The shift in power from the aristocracy to the warrior class was gradual but inexorable. By the late 12th century, the samurai had grown strong enough to challenge the imperial court directly, setting the stage for one of the most significant conflicts in Japanese history, the Genpei War. The Genpei War was a 5-year conflict that pitted two powerful samurai clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, against each other in a struggle for control of Japan. The roots of the war lay in decades of political maneuvering at the Heian court. By the late 12th century, the Taira clan, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, had risen to dominate the court, much like the Fujiwara before them. However, their dominance was resented by rival samurai clans, most notably the Minamoto. In 1180, Minamoto no Yoritomo, a young and ambitious leader of the Minamoto clan, launched a rebellion against the Taira. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war, with both sides rallying samurai warriors to their cause. The war was brutal and saw many of the tactics that would define samurai warfare for centuries to come: light cavalry, mounted archery, and close-quarters sword fighting. The turning point of the war came in 1184 at the Battle of Ichi no Tani, where the Minamoto scored a decisive victory over the Taira. 2 years later, the final blow was struck at the Battle of Dan no Ura, a dramatic naval battle in which the Taira were completely defeated. Taira no Kiyomori's infant grandson, the Emperor Antoku, was drowned during the battle, and the Minamoto emerged as the uncontested rulers of Japan. With his victory, Minamoto no Yoritomo became Japan's first shogun, a military ruler who wielded more power than the emperor. Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, a new government based in the city of Kamakura, far from the imperial court in Kyoto. While the emperor remained a symbolic figurehead, true power now lay with the shogun and the samurai class. The Kamakura shogunate marked the beginning of nearly 700 years of samurai rule in Japan. Under the shogunate, the samurai class became the dominant force in Japanese society, and Bushido began to take on greater significance as the guiding code for samurai behavior. The Kamakura period also saw the establishment of feudalism in Japan, as daimyo controlled large swathes of land and pledged their loyalty to the shogun in exchange for protection and military support. While the Kamakura shogunate brought a degree of stability to Japan, it was not without its challenges. The most significant threat came from across the sea, in the form of the Mongol Empire. In the late 13th century, the Mongols, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, attempted to invade Japan twice, in 1274 and 1281. The first invasion was a small-scale assault that saw Mongol forces land on the island of Kyushu. However, the Mongols were not accustomed to Japan's terrain and tactics, and they faced fierce resistance from the samurai. After only a few days of fighting, a sudden storm, believed by the Japanese to be a divine wind, or kamikaze, destroyed much of the Mongol fleet, forcing them to retreat retreat. Undeterred, Kublai Khan launched a second, larger invasion in 1281. This time, the Mongol forces numbered over 140,000, making it one of the largest amphibious invasions in history. However, once again, the Japanese were aided by the weather. After months of fierce fighting, another typhoon struck, decimating the Mongol fleet and effectively ending their attempts to conquer Japan. The kamikaze storms became legendary, and the Japanese believed that the gods had intervened to protect their homeland. While the Kamakura shogunate survived the Mongol invasions, the cost of defending Japan left the government weakened. The strain on the shogunate's resources, combined with internal political tensions, eventually led to its downfall in 1333, when the Ashikaga clan seized power and established the Ashikaga shogunate. The Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi shogunate, ruled Japan from 1336 to 1573. While the Ashikaga clan managed to maintain power for several centuries, their rule was far less stable than that of the Kamakura shogunate. The early years of the Ashikaga shogunate were marked by a power struggle between the shogun and the emperor, leading to the Nanboku-cho period, during which rival imperial courts existed in the north and south of Japan. Eventually, the Ashikaga shogunate restored a degree of order, and the 15th century saw a cultural renaissance in Japan. The period is often referred to as the Muromachi period, after the district in Kyoto, where the Ashikaga had their headquarters. This was a time of great artistic achievement, with the development of no theater, tea ceremonies, and ink painting. However, beneath the surface of cultural flourishing was a nation once again on the brink of chaos. In 1467, the Onin War broke out, plunging Japan into the Sengoku period, or Warring States period. For over a century, Japan was engulfed in civil war as daimyo across the country vied for control. Samurai armies marched across the land, burning villages, besieging castles, and slaughtering their enemies in a seemingly endless cycle of violence. Yet even in this time of war, there were figures who sought to bring order to the chaos. Three warlords, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would emerge as the unifiers of Japan, each playing a crucial role in the eventual end of the Sengoku period. From the cultured elegance of the Heian court to the brutal battlefields of the Sengoku period, the age of the samurai was a time of profound transformation in Japan. The samurai, once humble retainers to the aristocracy, had risen to become the ruling class, shaping the political, social, and cultural landscape of Japan for centuries to come. The code of Bushido, the ideals of loyalty and honor, and the warrior ethos that defined the samurai would continue to influence Japan long after the Sengoku period ended. The bloody chaos of the Sengoku period had come to an end. Japan, ravaged by more than a century of civil war, was finally about to experience an era of relative peace and stability under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. Yet, this peace came at a price. The once expansive ties Japan had with the rest of the world were severed, its ports closed, its culture frozen in time. For over 2 centuries, Japan would remain isolated from the outside world, its samurai still standing guard, but now in a time of peace. As the rest of the globe spun forward through the age of exploration, industrialization, and the birth of modern nations, Japan remained locked in a feudal order until the inevitable knock came at the door from the west. The unification of Japan began with Oda Nobunaga, who, during the late 16th century, launched a brutal campaign to bring the feuding daimyo under his control. Following his assassination, his loyal general Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued the mission, bringing much of the country under one rule. However, the ultimate consolidation of power came after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where a third man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, decisively defeated his rivals and established a new era in Japanese history. In 1603, Ieyasu was officially appointed shogun, the supreme military leader of Japan. This marked the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, which would govern Japan for more than 250 years. Unlike previous shogunates, the Tokugawa regime was far more centralized and stable. It instituted a strict class system, carefully regulated the daimyo, and ensured that no single warlord could challenge its authority again. Tokugawa Ieyasu's genius lay in his ability to create a system that ensured peace without relying on constant military conquest conquest, his government established the capital in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, far from the imperial court in Kyoto, which allowed the shogun to rule without interference from the emperor or other noble factions. The Tokugawa family implemented policies to maintain a delicate balance of power between the samurai, daimyo, and common people, preventing rebellion while simultaneously ensuring the rigid social structure remained in place. One of the key innovations of the Tokugawa shogunate was the creation of the bakuhan system, a form of centralized feudalism that effectively kept the daimyo in check. Under this system, the shogun directly controlled about a quarter of Japan's land, including the richest agricultural regions, while the rest was divided among the daimyo. However, the daimyo were required to swear loyalty to the shogun and follow strict rules that limited their autonomy. Perhaps the most effective means of control was the policy known as sankin kotai, or alternate attendance. This policy required the daimyo to spend every other year in Edo, where their families were kept as virtual hostages to ensure their loyalty. The daimyo were also obligated to maintain lavish residences in Edo, which placed a considerable financial strain on them. As a result, much of the daimyo's wealth was funneled into maintaining appearances in the capital, rather than raising armies to challenge the shogun. This system created a highly stratified society, where movement between social classes was nearly impossible. At the top were the samurai, who served as administrators and military leaders. Below them were the peasants, who made up the majority of the population and were responsible for farming and paying taxes. Artisans and merchants were ranked even lower, though the latter would gradually amass considerable wealth during this era. One of the defining features of the Tokugawa era was the policy of Sengoku, or closed country. In 1639, the shogunate issued a series of edicts that effectively sealed Japan off from the outside world. All foreign trade, with the exception of limited contact with the Dutch and Chinese, was banned. Christian missionaries, who had been active in Japan during the 16th century, were expelled, and Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country on pain of death. The reasons behind this dramatic decision were both practical and ideological. The Tokugawa government feared that foreign influences, particularly Christianity, could destabilize their carefully crafted social order. The arrival of European missionaries, especially from Portugal and Spain, had led to the rapid spread of Christianity in some parts of Japan. This threatened to undermine the traditional Shinto and Buddhist religious structures that helped to legitimize the shogunate's rule. In 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion, a large-scale uprising by predominantly Christian peasants in southwestern Japan, confirmed these fears. Though the rebellion was brutally suppressed, it convinced the Tokugawa government that foreign influence needed to be minimized at all costs. By closing the country, the shogunate hoped to preserve Japan's political stability and protect its cultural traditions from outside interference. The policy of Sengoku, however, was not total isolation. The shogunate maintained limited trade with China and Korea, and the Dutch were allowed to continue trading at a single outpost on the small artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. The Dutch, unlike other Europeans, were willing to comply with Japan's strict rules, including a ban on Christian proselytizing. Through these limited contacts, Japan continued to receive news of the outside world, albeit in a highly controlled manner. While Japan remained cut off from much of the world, life inside the country during the Edo period was marked by a sense of order and continuity. The Tokugawa shogunate's emphasis on stability meant that radical change was discouraged, and this was reflected in the rigid class structure that governed Japanese society. At the top of this hierarchy were the samurai, who had evolved from warriors into bureaucrats and administrators. Since Japan was no longer engaged in large-scale warfare, many samurai found themselves without a clear role. Instead of fighting on the battlefield, they worked as government officials, overseeing the collection of taxes, administering justice, and maintaining public order. However, the peaceful conditions also meant that many samurai struggled to maintain their traditional lifestyles. With few opportunities for battle, some samurai sank into poverty, while others became ronin, masterless samurai who wandered the country in search of employment. Below the samurai were the peasants, who made up about 80% of Japan's population. They were responsible for producing rice, the lifeblood of the economy, and were heavily taxed by the government. Despite their low social status, peasants were considered essential to the well-being of the country, and strict laws were in place to keep them tied to the land. Movement between social classes was prohibited, and peasants were not allowed to engage in any activities other than farming. Beneath the peasants were the artisans, who produced goods such as clothing, pottery, and tools. Artisans were respected for their craftsmanship, but they were still considered lower in status than the peasants because they did not produce food. Finally, at the bottom of the social hierarchy were the merchants. Despite their low status, merchants became increasingly wealthy as the economy of the Edo period shifted from agriculture to commerce. This created a paradox. The wealthiest members of society were often those with the least social prestige. Despite its isolation, or perhaps because of it, Japan experienced a cultural renaissance during the Edo period. The relative peace and stability of the era allowed for the flourishing of the arts, and the shogunate's policies encouraged the development of a unique Japanese culture. One of the most notable cultural developments was the rise of kabuki theater, a form of drama that combined elaborate costumes, dynamic performances, and stylized gestures to tell stories of love, betrayal, and revenge. Kabuki became immensely popular among the common people, and its influence spread throughout Japanese society. At the same time, the ukiyo-e, literally pictures of the floating world, woodblock print style emerged, depicting scenes of everyday life, beautiful landscapes, and famous kabuki actors. These prints were mass-produced, making them affordable to a wide audience and creating a thriving market for popular art. Artists like Katsushika Hokusai, whose famous print The Great Wave off Kanagawa has become iconic, were able to reach both commoners and elite patrons. In addition to visual art, literature also flourished during the Edo period. The famous haiku poet Matsuo Basho perfected the art of capturing fleeting moments of beauty in just a few syllables, while novels like The Life of an Amorous Man by Ihara Saikaku explored the hedonistic lifestyles of Japan's merchant class. By the early 19th century, cracks were beginning to show in the Tokugawa shogunate's facade of stability. The rigid class system, while effective at maintaining order, stifled social mobility and economic growth. The samurai class, in particular, was facing a crisis. Many samurai, whose stipends were based on the rice tax, found themselves in financial trouble as Japan's economy shifted away from agriculture and toward commerce. The merchant class, meanwhile, was growing wealthier and more influential, challenging the old social order. At the same time, the shogunate's isolationist policies were coming under increasing pressure. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay with a fleet of black ships, demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. The arrival of the Americans was a shock to the Japanese, who realized that their country was technologically far behind the West. Perry's visit, followed by the signing of unequal treaties with the United States and other Western powers, marked the beginning of the end for the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan stood at a crossroads in the mid-19th century. After centuries of isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, the country was thrust into an era of rapid and transformative change, ignited by external pressure from the West and internal dissatisfaction with the old feudal order. What followed was one of the most extraordinary national transformations in world history. The Meiji Restoration not only dismantled the centuries-old samurai-led feudal system, but also rapidly modernized Japan, transforming it from an isolated island nation into an imperial power capable of competing with Western nations. This chapter explores how Japan moved from its centuries of isolation to the birth of a new imperial Japan, reshaping its society, economy, military, and identity. It's the story of the Meiji Emperor, visionary leaders, and a nation that faced the future with a determination to never be colonized. In the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate's isolationist policies came under intense pressure as Western nations sought to open new markets in Asia. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships in 1853 signaled the beginning of the end for Japan's closed-door policy. Perry's demand for Japan to open its ports to American trade left the Tokugawa government with little choice. In 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, ending over 2 centuries of isolation. However, the treaties that followed were heavily lopsided, granting Western powers privileges in Japan without requiring reciprocal benefits. These unequal treaties angered many Japanese, especially those who saw the shogunate as weak for succumbing to foreign pressure. Discontent grew within the country, particularly among factions of samurai and local daimyo, who felt the shogunate had failed to protect Japan's sovereignty. By the 1860s, Japan was in turmoil. Samurai from the Satsuma and Choshu domains, along with other dissatisfied factions, rallied around the emperor, calling for the restoration of imperial rule and the expulsion of foreigners. These factions opposed both the Tokugawa shogunate and the treaties with the West, seeing the restoration of the emperor as the key to reasserting Japan's strength. In 1867, the young Emperor Meiji ascended the throne. The following year, in 1868, the pro-imperial forces successfully overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. It marked the end of 265 years of Tokugawa rule and the beginning of a new era in Japanese history. An era of modernization, reform, and ultimately empire. The Meiji Restoration was more than just the return of political power to the emperor. It was a radical reorganization of Japanese society, government, and economy aimed at modernizing the country in response to the perceived threat posed by the Western imperial powers. In the early years of the Meiji period, the emperor and his advisors sought to dismantle the old feudal order and replace it with a centralized modern state. The feudal domains controlled by the daimyo were abolished, and in their place, Japan was reorganized into prefectures governed directly by the central government. This new system helped to consolidate power in the hands of the emperor and his bureaucrats, breaking the centuries-old power of the samurai and daimyo. The abolition of the samurai class was one of the most significant reforms of the Meiji era. For centuries, the samurai had been the dominant military and political force in Japan, but in a rapidly modernizing world, their role as warriors became obsolete. In 1871, the government officially abolished the samurai's hereditary privileges, and in 1876, it banned the carrying of swords in public, a deeply symbolic act that marked the end of the samurai era. While these reforms were met with resistance, most notably in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, where disaffected samurai rose up against the new government, Japan's transformation was unstoppable. The Meiji leaders, often referred to as the Genro or elder statesmen, were determined to modernize Japan's institutions in every way possible to avoid the fate of China and other nations that had been colonized by Western powers. One of the slogans of the Meiji era was Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army. The Meiji leaders understood that to secure Japan's sovereignty, they needed not only a modern military, but also a modern economy capable of supporting it. As a result, they embarked on a series of sweeping reforms that touched nearly every aspect of Japanese life. In the realm of education, the government established a national school system based on Western models, with the goal of creating a literate and disciplined population. Western science, technology, and philosophy were introduced, and thousands of Japanese students were sent abroad to study in Europe and the United States. At the same time, foreign experts known as Oyatoi Gaikokujin were brought to Japan to help build the country's infrastructure and modernize its industries. In 1873, the government introduced compulsory military conscription, requiring all male citizens to serve in the armed forces. This not only helped create a modern, Western-style army, but also broke down class divisions by requiring men of all social backgrounds to serve side by side. The government also modernized the navy, acquiring modern warships from Britain and building shipyards to produce its own vessels. Economically, the Meiji government promoted industrialization through a combination of state-led initiatives and private entrepreneurship. The government established state-owned factories and mines, which were later sold to private businessmen who became the founders of Japan's powerful zaibatsu, or financial conglomerates. These zaibatsu, such as Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and Sumitomo, would come to dominate the Japanese economy in the following decades. In addition to industry, Japan also reformed its financial system, establishing a central bank and adopting a modern currency system. The government implemented land reforms that privatized agricultural land, increasing productivity and creating a class of wealthy landowners who would help drive Japan's economic development. While the Meiji leaders were committed to modernization, they also understood the importance of maintaining political stability. In 1889, after years of debate and study of Western political systems, Japan promulgated its first constitution, known as the Meiji Constitution. This document established a constitutional monarchy with the emperor at its center, while also creating a bicameral parliament, known as the Diet, composed of an elected lower house and an appointed upper house. Although the Meiji Constitution appeared to introduce democratic elements into Japanese politics, real power remained concentrated in the hands of the emperor and his advisors. The Genros, the elder statesmen who had played key roles in the Meiji Restoration, continued to hold significant influence behind the scenes. The constitution granted the emperor significant executive authority, including control over the military and the ability to dissolve the Diet. Nonetheless, the Meiji Constitution represented a significant step toward modern governance, and it helped to legitimize the Meiji government in the eyes of both the Japanese people and foreign powers. The establishment of a modern legal system, based on Western models, further solidified Japan's status as a modern nation-state. As Japan modernized internally, it also began to assert itself on the world stage, particularly in East Asia. The Meiji government recognized that in order to secure Japan's independence, it needed to establish itself as a regional power, capable of competing with the Western imperialists who were carving up China. Japan's first major test came in the form of the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, fought over control of Korea. For centuries, Korea had been a vassal state of China, but Japan sought to break Chinese influence and bring Korea into its own sphere. The war ended in a decisive Japanese victory, with Japan gaining control of Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands, as well as significant influence over Korea. Japan's victory over China shocked the Western powers, who had long viewed Japan as a backward, feudal society. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended the war, forced China to cede territory and pay a large indemnity to Japan, signaling the emergence of Japan as a new imperial power in East Asia. However, Japan's ambitions soon brought it into conflict with Russia, another major player in the region. In 1904, tensions over control of Korea and Manchuria erupted into the Russo-Japanese War, a conflict that would have far-reaching consequences for both Japan and the world. Against all odds, Japan won a series of stunning victories over the Russian army and navy, culminating in the destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The war ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, mediated by US President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan emerged as the dominant power in East Asia, gaining control of Korea and a sphere of influence in southern Manchuria. The victory over Russia, a major European power, was seen as a watershed moment in global history. It was the first time an Asian nation had defeated a Western power in modern times, and it marked the beginning of Japan's rise as a world power. In the wake of its victory over Russia, Japan continued to expand its empire. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, which had been a de facto protectorate since the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The annexation of Korea was part of Japan's broader imperial strategy, which sought to secure resources and territory in order to support Japan's growing industrial economy. The annexation of Korea marked the beginning of a new phase in Japan's imperial expansion, one that would ultimately lead to conflict with the Western powers in the 20th century. However, it also reflected the growing power and confidence of a nation that had transformed itself from a feudal backwater into a modern imperial state in just a few short decades. By the end of the Meiji period in 1912, Japan had undergone a profound transformation. It had moved from being an isolated feudal society to a modern, industrialized nation capable of competing with the world's great powers. Meiji Restoration had laid the groundwork for Japan's future as an imperial power, but it also set the stage for the conflicts and challenges that would come in the 20th century. Japan's rapid modernization and rise to power during the Meiji era were remarkable achievements, but they also came with significant costs, both domestically, as traditional ways of life were upended, and internationally, as Japan's imperial ambitions brought it into conflict with other nations. As Japan entered the 20th century, it stood at the threshold of a new era, one in which its quest for empire would lead it into the global conflicts that would define the next phase of its history. The dawn of the 20th century marked a new chapter in Japan's history. The Meiji era, had transformed the nation into an industrial powerhouse, positioning it as a formidable player on the world stage. Yet, as Japan embarked on its imperial ambitions, it also faced a complex web of domestic challenges and international tensions. The period from 1912 to 1945 was defined by Japan's aggressive expansionist policies, its involvement in global conflicts, and the consequences of its militaristic ambitions. This chapter examines Japan's quest for empire, the rise of militarism, and the path that led to its involvement in World War II. In 1912, Emperor Meiji passed away, and his son, Emperor Taisho, ascended to the throne. The Taisho era was marked by a brief experiment in democracy and liberalism, a stark contrast to the preceding Meiji period characterized by authoritarian rule. During this time, Japan experienced a wave of political reform and social change, known as Taisho democracy. Political parties gained more power, and there was an increasing emphasis on civil rights and political participation. The Japanese populace became more politically active, leading to the rise of various political movements and labor unions. Intellectuals and activists advocated for greater freedoms and social reforms, pushing for changes that included women's suffrage and labor rights. However, this period of liberalism was short-lived and faced considerable opposition from conservative factions within the military and government. As the world entered World War I in 1914, Japan seized the opportunity to expand its influence in Asia. Aligning itself with the Allies, Japan sought to assert its dominance in the Pacific and Asia by taking advantage of the war's upheaval. Japanese forces occupied German-held territories in China and the Pacific, including the Shandong Peninsula and several Pacific islands. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 formalized Japan's territorial gains, but it also led to tensions with Western powers who were wary of Japan's growing ambitions. The post-war period saw the rise of militarism and nationalism in Japan, fueled by a combination of economic challenges, social unrest, and a desire for greater global standing. The 1920s brought economic turmoil as Japan faced the consequences of inflation, unemployment, and labor strikes. The government struggled to address these issues, leading to disillusionment among the populace. As economic conditions worsened, militaristic and nationalistic ideologies gained traction. The military increasingly influenced Japanese politics, with army and navy leaders advocating for expansionism as a solution to Japan's domestic problems. Nationalist groups emerged, promoting the idea of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which envisioned Japanese dominance over Asia and the expulsion of Western powers. In this environment, the military began to see itself as the savior of the nation. This growing influence culminated in a series of incidents, including the assassination of political leaders and the military's involvement in domestic affairs. By the late 1920s, the military had gained significant control over the government, undermining the democratic progress made during the Taisho era. The pivotal moment in Japan's turn toward militarism came in 1931 with the Manchurian incident. The Japanese army staged an explosion on the South Manchurian Railway as a pretext to invade Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. Despite the lack of authorization from the Japanese government, the military quickly occupied Manchuria and established a puppet state known as Manchukuo. The invasion was met with international condemnation, particularly from the League of Nations, which called for Japan to withdraw. However, the Japanese government, heavily influenced by the military, refused to comply. In 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, signaling its growing isolation from the international community. The occupation of Manchuria marked a turning point for Japan, solidifying its militaristic stance and expansionist ambitions. The army began to push for further incursions into China, leading to increased tensions with the Chinese government. The Chinese Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, despite their differences, united in opposition to Japanese aggression. The tensions in China erupted into full-scale war in 1937 with the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces launched a brutal invasion of China, capturing key cities, including Beijing and Shanghai. The war was characterized by extreme violence and atrocities committed by Japanese troops, most notably the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were killed and widespread sexual violence was perpetrated against women. The conflict quickly escalated, becoming one of the largest theaters of World War II. Japan sought to establish a puppet government in China, but the Chinese resistance proved resilient. The Chinese nationalists and communists continued to fight against Japanese occupation, receiving varying degrees of support from Western powers, particularly the United States. As the war dragged on, Japan faced increasing international condemnation for its actions in China. The United States, which had previously maintained a policy of neutrality, began to impose economic sanctions on Japan, cutting off vital supplies of oil and other resources. This further strained Japan's economy and fueled military leaders' belief that war with the United States was inevitable. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack aimed to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet, allowing Japan to secure its territorial gains in Asia and the Pacific without interference from the United States. The attack was a tactical success for Japan, but it galvanized American resolve and led to the US entering World War II. Following Pearl Harbor, Japan rapidly expanded its empire in Southeast Asia, capturing British Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. The early successes of the Japanese military created an empire that stretched from the islands of the Pacific to the coasts of China. However, as the war continued, Japan's overextension began to take its toll. In 1942, the tide began to turn against Japan. The United States achieved significant victories in the Battle of Midway, where it dealt a crippling blow to the Japanese fleet. This marked the beginning of a series of Allied offensives that would eventually lead to the liberation of occupied territories and the gradual weakening of Japanese forces. As the war dragged on, Japan faced increasing challenges on multiple fronts. The Allied forces, bolstered by the industrial might of the United States, launched a series of campaigns in the Pacific, gradually recapturing territory and moving closer to Japan itself. The brutal island-hopping strategy saw fierce battles at places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, where Japanese forces fought to the last man. By 1945, Japan was on the defensive, with its cities facing relentless bombardment from Allied forces. The strategic bombing campaign, particularly the firebombing of Tokyo and other urban centers, inflicted devastating damage and civilian casualties. The Japanese economy and infrastructure were in ruins, and the populace faced severe shortages of food and essential goods. In August 1945, the United States made the controversial decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in an effort to bring about a swift end to the war. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, followed by a second bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later. The bombings resulted in unprecedented destruction and loss of life, with hundreds of thousands killed, injured, or left to suffer from the long-term effects of radiation. Facing overwhelming devastation and the prospect of further destruction, Japan announced its unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, officially ending World War II. The consequences of the war would shape Japan for generations, leaving deep scars on the nation and its people. The end of World War II marked a profound turning point in Japan's history. Emerging from the devastation of war, the nation faced an uncertain future, grappling with the consequences of its militaristic past. However, the years that followed would witness an extraordinary transformation, one of resilience, innovation, and unprecedented economic growth. This chapter explores Japan's post-war reconstruction, the development of its economy, and the cultural shifts that defined the nation from 1945 to 1989. In the aftermath of Japan's surrender in 1945, the country found itself under Allied occupation led by the United States. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, landscape. As Japan entered the 1990s, it found itself at a crossroads, facing challenges that would shape its trajectory for decades to come. The era of the Japanese economic miracle had come to a sudden halt, giving way to economic stagnation, demographic changes, and a re-evaluation of national identity. This chapter explores Japan's transition into the modern era, examining the factors that influenced its economy, society, and global standing from 1990 to the present. The early 1990s marked a seismic shift in Japan's economic landscape as the asset price bubble burst. During the 1980s, Japan experienced unprecedented growth, fueled by speculation in real estate and the stock market. The Nikkei stock index reached an all-time high in December 1989, reflecting rampant optimism. However, the excessive speculation led to inflated asset prices, creating an unsustainable economic environment. In 1990, the bubble burst, leading to a dramatic decline in both the stock market and real estate prices. The aftermath of this collapse plunged Japan into what became known as the lost decade. Banks were left with a mountain of bad loans, and the economy entered a prolonged period of stagnation, characterized by low growth, deflation, and rising unemployment. The government's response to the crisis involved a series of monetary and fiscal measures aimed at stimulating the economy. Interest rates were slashed, and public works projects were initiated to spur economic activity. However, these efforts proved insufficient to revitalize the economy fully, leading to a pervasive sense of uncertainty and anxiety among the populace. As the economic malaise persisted, Japan experienced significant cultural and social changes. The lost decade prompted a shift in attitudes, with many people questioning the values that had previously driven their society. The once unshakable faith in lifelong employment and corporate loyalty began to wane as job security diminished and younger generations sought alternative paths. The rise of non-regular employment, characterized by part-time and contract work, became a defining feature of the labor market. Many individuals found themselves trapped in precarious employment situations, leading to a sense of disenchantment and frustration among the youth. The term "freeter," referring to those who pursue non-permanent or part-time work, emerged as a symbol of this new economic reality. Additionally, societal expectations regarding family structures and gender roles underwent significant transformations. The traditional notion of the salaryman as the primary breadwinner was challenged as more women entered the workforce and pursued careers. The increasing emphasis on individualism and personal fulfillment led to changing family dynamics, with many opting for delayed marriage or choosing to remain single. The Great East Japan earthquake of March 11, 2011, had a profound impact on the nation, both physically and emotionally. Measuring 9.0 on the Richter scale, the earthquake triggered a massive tsunami that devastated coastal communities and caused widespread destruction. The disaster claimed thousands of lives, displaced entire towns, and left a lasting scar on the Japanese psyche. One of the most significant consequences of the earthquake was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, which occurred when the tsunami overwhelmed the nuclear power plant, leading to meltdowns and the release of radioactive materials. The incident raised serious concerns about nuclear safety and the government's energy policies, prompting public outcry and protests against nuclear power. In the aftermath of the disaster, Japan faced a challenging path to recovery. The government implemented extensive reconstruction efforts, but the emotional toll on survivors was profound. The disaster also led to a reassessment of Japan's energy policies, with many citizens calling for a shift away from nuclear power toward renewable energy sources. As Japan entered the 21st century, it confronted a demographic crisis characterized by an aging population and declining birth rates. The combination of low fertility rates and increased life expectancy created a scenario where the proportion of elderly citizens grew rapidly, placing immense strain on the economy and social services. By the 2020s, Japan had one of the highest proportions of elderly citizens in the world, raising concerns about workforce shortages and the sustainability of social welfare programs. The government implemented various measures to address these challenges, including promoting policies to encourage childbirth and supporting families. To combat the labor shortage, Japan also began to explore immigration as a potential solution. However, the nation historically held a cautious stance toward immigration, emphasizing the need to balance cultural preservation with economic necessity. This tension between tradition and the need for a more diverse workforce would shape discussions about Japan's future. Despite the challenges posed by economic stagnation and demographic shifts, Japan continued to excel in technological innovation and research. The nation remained a global leader in various fields, including robotics, electronics, and automotive manufacturing. Japanese companies invested heavily in research and development, fostering a culture of innovation. The country became synonymous with cutting-edge technology, producing advancements in artificial intelligence, automation, and renewable energy. Japan's commitment to education and research helped maintain its status as a hub for technological development. The government also recognized the importance of fostering international partnerships and collaboration to enhance global competitiveness. Initiatives were launched to promote entrepreneurship, attract foreign investment, and strengthen ties with emerging markets, particularly in Asia. Japan's history is one of relentless change. War and peace, isolation and expansion, tradition and innovation. From the warriors of ancient times to the pioneers of modern technology, Japan continues to shape the world. The land of the rising sun's story isn't just about the past, it's about the future. What comes next is a new chapter, and the world is watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this.